to everyone for signing in, and a massive thank you to Jemima for being here this evening. A few words and a bit of background. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Barry Cranford. I'm actually the founder of the Front Engineers. So I also run RecWorks, which is a tech recruitment company. So here at RecWorks, we try to find ways that recruitment can be a force for good in the tech industry beyond just getting people jobs. So it all came about 13, 14 years ago when I was spending all my time calling Java developers, working just in the Java industry, and getting hung up on most of the time by people that weren't looking for work. And it just hit me that there must be a better way to spend my time and use the resources that we had. So that idea grew into what is now the London Java community. We founded that back in 2007. And it was pretty cool, quite interesting, seeing this unique way of getting people together. That led to the graduate developer community and creating some kind of sense of mentorship from grads to developers, led to the London CTOs in 2011, and then finally the Front Engineers in 2013. Here we are, which was a community that was trying to put real software engineering principles to front-end developers and kind of bring the two worlds together. So we used to do monthly presentations before the COVID situation and when we could get together. And now we're bringing those to Zoom. So which brings me on to this evening and Jemima. So a bit of background on Jemima, if you've not heard it before. She's a self-taught front-end developer and school-taught systems engineer from Lagos, Nigeria. She currently works at Telesoftas, is passionate about accessibility in web development and diversity and intersectionality in the tech space. And I've been informed that she's also slightly obsessed with cats and spends a lot of time reading slice of life or shounen manga. So Jemima, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. That was a very apt introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Jemima, and today I'm going to be talking to you about state management for React application. Just a quick heads up, it's 9 p.m. here, and I've spent the last 3 hours battling with a WordPress site only to realize I should have been hosting it on WordPress.org and not WordPress.com. So forgive me if I'm not at my best. It's been a long day, but yeah, let's get started. I'm going to be talking to you about state management for React applications and middleware for state management libraries. So my name is Jemima, as Barry said, and I'm a front-end developer, self-taught from Lagos, Nigeria. You can find me online anywhere at Jemima Abu. So let's just get into it. Why did I want to give this talk? Because when I first started with React, I found it confusing. I was coming from HTML and CSS. Like I had not learned any other framework before I started learning React. Like I barely knew JavaScript, honestly, by the time I started learning React. So the thought of states and then, because in JavaScript, you want to update your variable, all you need to do is something like document.get element by ID, you know, and you can update anything. But with React, you have all these things like state and set state and components, and it was very confusing for me. And then understanding how state worked, how like the DOM gets rendered every time, or how you need to use a certain method to actually update state, I never really got it. It was like, okay, wait, so I have state, and it's like, yeah, but then I can't change the state variable. I need to use another method to change the state variable. And it's like, yeah, and I'm like, I don't understand that. And then there were also a lot of options going further. By the time you finally grasp the concept of state and set state, then they were like, actually, there's this thing you need to learn called the state management library, because apparently states doesn't just work in React. You need to use all these other libraries to manage it. And I did not understand that either. I think basically a lot of my talks are just, I don't understand this. Now I understand it. I'm going to give a talk on it. That's the general progression. But yeah, so when I was getting into state management, there were like so many options. It was like there was Redux, but then there was Flux and there was MobX. And then some people were like, no, you should just use context. And then I did not understand why there were so many options for everything. And as I went further along, I realized because with like everything in JavaScript, people just kind of like having options. But yeah, it was very interesting. Okay, and then In general, it's just a complicated concept. The concept of state and understanding why you need to do things in a certain way or how things work in a certain way, it's not very easy to understand. A lot of times you can do things and you don't really understand the underlying reason behind them. Like you know that, okay, I need to use set states to update the state, but why do I need to use set state? What is the reason for needing to use a certain method instead of just like updating it as a variable itself? So we're going to cover all those concepts and then some more. So let's get into it. Oh yeah, I also had this GIF here. Really, I had to read a lot of articles and I had to go through a lot of practice before I could finally grasp the concept of how it worked and not just like the fact that it worked. Like, yeah, I know it works, but like, how does it work? Why do I have to do it this way? So in this talk, we're basically just going to simplify the concepts of states and state management in React. So now what is state? When we say state, we're hearing the word state being thrown around. What is it? Basically, the easiest way that I think of it is that state is the part of an application that can change. So now this is like one of the most rudimentary definitions because clearly as you go deeper into your React components or your React applications, it could get more complicated than that. But at the very base level, state is the part of an application that can change. What that means is whenever you have an application that requires some form of change on the screen. Let's say you need the second hand of a clock to move every 60 seconds, or you need the an input bar to display an error message, or you need a success button to be displayed, or a button, just like anything, any part of your React application that requires updating, that is the state of that application at that moment. Oh, what did I do? Oh, that was a link, my bad. So yeah, when you're rendering states, I wrote this code because this is like one of the first things I had to write when I was learning React. I started learning React, I think 3 years ago, and hooks wasn't really a thing back then. So we had to write class components. If you're writing a class component, you need to define your state in the constructor, and then you can call your state, but you always have to refer to it using this. So this is like the base way of calling state. You have your constructor, and you define your states within your constructor, and then you can call it at any point in your code using the this.state. So in this GIF, which looks real tiny now, but would have looked larger on a projector, you see, you got to think about these things. It's basically just showing you how the states actually affect the DOM every time it's being rendered. So this is, I'm using the React profiler. It's a really cool dev tool that allows you, basically just allows you to see how your React application is interacting with the DOM and how things are being rendered. So you can see here in my little input bar, I have, my input has a value of the state property that I'm typing. So every time I make a change, you can see in the profiler here, each time the DOM got re-rendered, you can see it got rendered 5 times, which is basically each of the times I press the key for the updating state value. So that is how state works. Every single time you make a change on your DOM, it causes a re-rendering, and that is what causes your app to actually update. But then the thing with state is that a property you may hear about state a lot is that it's immutable. So now what does being immutable mean? It simply means that a state value should not be reassigned in itself. So think of it as assigning a const variable in JavaScript. Whenever you assign a variable as a constant, you cannot reassign that variable anywhere else. So that variable therefore becomes immutable. It's the same thing with your this.state value. A state value cannot just be reassigned willy-nilly at any point in your code. So you cannot, for example, update your state value by saying something like this.state.name. You have to use this.setState because that is the method that React has given you to actually update your state value. So now I have my this.setState and I'm setting my states to whatever property I want it to be. So how this would work, for example, is that if you're using an input thingy, you cannot just update the value for the input if the value is set to a state. And honestly, when I first started with React, this thing gave me such a headache. I was like, I don't understand. It's an input element. The only thing it's meant to do is taking values. What do you mean I can't just update the value? I found it was so confusing to me because like in HTML, you would never need to enter anything like on change because you don't need to detect when the input is changing. You should just type normally. But in React, because state itself should be immutable, if you want your input elements to be linked, your input elements to have a value of a state property, then you need to have a handler method that actually is responsible for updating that state property. So when I first started, it just seemed like a very roundabout way, but it kind of makes sense now because you wouldn't really want your input elements to be changing state willy-nilly and affecting things at other points in your code that you may not really have wanted it to affect. So yes, every time you use a state value and you want to actually update the value, then you just use your this.setState and it'll work. The thing with this.setState is that it works asynchronously. So now what does this word asynchronously mean? It basically means that it doesn't work at the instant you think it's working. So you can see here, what I'm doing in the console is that I'm console.logging every time I update my states. But now you notice that here in the first console.log, it's actually blank, even though I've already typed the letter W in my input, because what happened was that this.setState does not actually run at the instance of at which you created it. What it does is that it runs after the, let's say, you've set your states and now you've made a change. That change is going to be reflected on the DOM, and then the state is going to be updated after the change is reflected on the DOM. So what that means is that every single time you update states on the DOM, it's not actually updated immediately everywhere. So this could be a problem, for example, if you were trying to, let's say I was trying to detect the length of this property now. And I was like, okay, if the length of the state property is equals to 5, for example, then let another function run. This function would not run by the time I had typed 5 letters, because at that point, my state that you can see in the console here is only 4 letters. So you need to keep in mind that this.setState actually works asynchronously, and that, you need to put, that's why you have all your promises and everything in React. So once setState is called, don't interact with the state until the next render. So every single time you call setState, wait until your component has rendered, and then you can actually react with your state. So that is it for the state variable and how to update the state variable. So now we're going to go into the concept of local state. So what is local state? Local state basically means that every state property only exists within the component that you described it in. Think of it as having a local variable in JavaScript, or a local function, for example. If you have a function and you define a variable within that function, that variable is only accessible within the confines of that function. So it's the same thing with states. If I have a component A and I define my state in that component A, no other component can access the state that I've defined in that component A. So every single state is local to the component that it was defined in. So here I have 2 input elements. I have 2 input components. I have input A and input B. In each of these input components, I have defined a this.state property with a value of name, and I'm calling both of them within each of these input components. But now you see that when it's rendered in the DOM, even though they have the same name, they have the same variable name, the states in input A is not affecting the states in input B, because it's a local state. It's only linked to the component that is defined. Now, of course, this is really useful because a lot of times you may use the same state values across multiple elements, really with things like if you have forms and you need to detect is active or is toggle, or for example, imagine if you had like an is toggle state property that was defined across like 4 components, and every single time you clicked one menu, like 4 other things dropped down the page. So having local variables, having states as local variables is really important, because it makes sure that you're only affecting the component you meant to affect at that moment. And then we come to the concept of React hooks, which I just learned, I think, what was it, this year? I know it came out in 2018, but I didn't learn it for a while because I was like, I don't need another new library or methodology. And I started learning React hooks, and I'm like, this is the best thing ever. Why hasn't all of React always been functional components? So React hooks basically took class components, and it was like, yeah, now we're going to prevent all that needing to define your classes and your constructors and calling this everywhere. And it's like, now components can just be functions, which was brilliant. And I love it. God bless whoever came up with that. So with React hooks, all you need to do is define your component as a function in the same way that you would define a regular function in, any JavaScript code that you're writing. So here I have the same input function now that I defined earlier, but now you can see the difference is that with my states, the way I define it in my class component is different from the way I'm defining it in hooks. So in the class component, you need to use like your this.state. Everything in the class component needs to be bound to like a this instance, because that is what is actually binding it to the main component. In hooks, you don't need to bind anything to anything because it just works the same way a function would work. So long as you define a variable within a function, it's going to work. It's brilliant. So yes, these are the differences between how you define state and how you update states in class and hooks. So in class, you need to use your this.state, and to change the state, you need to use this.setState. But in hooks, every time you create a new state instance, you have like an action creator that is automatically assigned to that. You have an action creator that you can assign to that state instance. So what I have here is my const name and set name. Set name is the action creator for my name state value. So every single time I call set name, whatever value I'm passing into it is just going to update name itself. And it's great. And I actually really like this because like when I had to use this dot set state a lot, it was like you're using this dot set state, and then you can do that thing where you do like the object deconstruction. So you can just do like name and then it will pass. But then also sometimes it's just like, I cannot remember all the state values that I have in this thing, and I'm getting myself confused. So because you have hooks and because you have the action creators that are linked to this, you know that, okay, if I'm calling set name, then obviously I'm only updating the value for name. If I'm calling set menu toggle, for example, I'm only updating the toggle value for menu. And it's great. And then finally, you do not have to call every single state property by typing this dot state dot whatever the property name is. You can literally just call the property name. It was so easy. I just really like hooks, but yeah, this is basically like the difference between class and hooks. And that great thing about hooks is that hooks actually allows you to share state logic. So when I was talking about local states, I mentioned that the state only exists within the confines of the component that you defined it in, and the same extends to the logic of that state. For example, if I was calling this dot set state dot name as e dot target dot value, that only exists within that component I am defining. So meaning for every other component I am working in, I need to create the state logic for all of that as well. But with hooks, we have these brilliant little things called custom hooks, which allows us create like methods that can be passed down to all our components. So here I'm creating a custom hook and I'm calling it use input change.js. Basically, this is going to be a custom hook that allows me, the same way you would have to define your onChange method for all your inputs in all your components, this custom hook is extracting that logic and storing it right here so that you never need to do that again. And it's great. The thing with custom hooks is that they're a bit more complicated than this to actually write, but this is like the base logic, as base as I could make it, fits within this little box. So yeah, I can just import that custom hook that I've created and then just pass it into whatever component I actually want to call it in. And it's great. So what this means is that now you can have shared state logic across multiple components. So I can use the same logic for like all the components in my code, and I don't have to actually include it in the components themselves, which is very great. And then we have global state. So it stands to reason that if you had local state, something called global state would exist as well. So what is global state? Global state is a state value that can be passed to all the components, actually, a state value that all components have access to. So before we said that state is a local variable in itself, meaning that it only exists in the component you define it in. But now what if you have a state property that you need to know if it has been changed across all the components in your code? Take, for example, an is authorized state property. So you have a state value that says if a user is authorized or not based on some property that you've defined. So now you need to know in each component if the user is authorized or not, because that is what is going to allow the user have access to these components. So now if your state property was only defined in, let's say it was only defined in your login component, by the time the user leaves that login component, there's no way of you tracking if that user is actually authorized or not. So that is why global state is really important when it comes to building large-scale applications that require shared states across multiple components. And then to understand the concept of local state, we need to understand the concept of data flow in React. How data flow works is that data flows downwards. So you have your parent component. Your parent components can pass data down as props to child components, but data cannot be passed upwards. What that means is if I make a change to my state value here, oh wait, do I have that? Yeah, I do pointer, perfect. If I make a change to my state value, let's say in this component, there's no way for my parent component to know that a change has been made because data does not flow upwards, it only flows downwards. So it's really important to know how you are manipulating data in React to understand why you need to use certain things at certain levels and when you may not need to use them. For example, if I just needed to pass down a state property to each component, so let's say here, I have my little header, and my header component has a prop. It takes in a props value of name, for example. So in my main application, I have name as a state value. Now I can pass this state value down to my header component as a prop, and it's going to work fine. So every single time the name value is updated in app, it will also update the name value in the header component, even though header is just using the name value as a prop. Same thing for grandchildren components. If I have a subtitle component that also takes in props, so even in header name, even though I'm passing a prop to subtitle as well, they would both still work with the same state updating method. So this is one way of handling, like, this is kind of like a global state passing down, because the children components are still getting updated each time the state is updated, which is great. But now, like I said before, what if we want our data to flow upwards? We don't want to flow downwards. So what I want is that when I make a change to my state in my child element, I want it to also be changed in the parent element. So take a look at, so yeah, if I want to change props in child, for example. So now in my subtitle component, I have set the name, the state value as the props that I'm passing in. And I'm going to update it here in the child component. So the catch is that data doesn't always flow in one direction. So like I was saying earlier, data flows in a downwards way, but sometimes you want data to flow upwards. Sometimes I want the change I made in the child components to be reflected in the parent component. But then if you look at this, so I have two input values here. The first input value is the parent component, and the second input value is the child component. But now you notice that when I make a change to the input value in the child component, it doesn't affect the parent component. But when I make a change to the parent component, it does affect the child component. So you can watch the GIF for a bit just to see like how the changes are affecting the child component. So even though the value is changed in the child component, the minute you make a change in the parent component, it's affected by everything. Hope this GIF is clear. So yeah, the problem is that you are making changes to components that you didn't mean to be making changes to, and then the changes you want to be reflected elsewhere are not actually being reflected. So this is why state management libraries come into place, because sometimes you just need to make sure that you know where and how your state is being changed across multiple components. So exactly, keeping track of states, it gets confusing because now you are passing down, if you're building a simple little app where all you needed to do was just pass down props, like a to-do list or something, and you don't even need to care about which other components are getting your state, it's fine. But now you're building a larger scale app and you have multiple components, and each of these components need the state value, and you want one component to be responsible for updating the state value, but you also want that to reflect across the whole application. It's going to get confusing for you to start keeping track of all these changes. And always having to pass props to things is another reason, because sometimes, let's say in this child component, for example, the child component doesn't actually need this prop that I'm passing down to it, but then because the grandchild component needs it, and like I said before, data only flows unidirectionally, so it's not possible for me to skip this child component and only render the props in the grandchild component, meaning I need to pass an unnecessary variable to the child component just so the child component can pass it to the grandchild component. Hope that makes sense. So yeah, these are like a couple of reasons why we actually need state management libraries. So now we're just going to go, we're going to look at a couple of state management libraries that you can use, and then we'll talk about middleware, and then that'll be it. So yeah, what are state management libraries? State management libraries are tools for managing state. It sounds obvious, and that's because it is. That is really just what they are. State management libraries are tools that allow you handle how your state is updated or how it's being managed or how it's tracked within your application, basically. So there are, like I said before, there are a lot of options for state management libraries. There's Redux, there's Context, there's Mobex, there's Flux. I think there's this new one that came out. I cannot remember the name, but I'm meant to give a talk on it at some point. Just Recoil, that's the name. Recoil, it's a non-new state management library that just came out. So I'm going to look into that as well and see what that's about. But yeah, the point is there are a lot of state management libraries, each of them suited for something, but we're only going to be looking at the first two, which is Redux and Context. So what is the Context state management library? From the React documentation, Context provides a way to pass data through the component 3 without having to pass props down manually at every level. So this is a reference to that last example I showed about having to pass unnecessary props to child components just so you can pass them to grandchild components. Sometimes you just don't need the props in the next component, but you could need them in like a generational component that you're not aware of. That is why context allows you have control about how these props are being passed down. So let's take a look at some inner workings of context. So how does context work? The first thing you need to do is create your context. Literally, all you need to do is just like you import your little React and then you create a theme context. What I'm doing here is I'm creating a default context, and then this is like my callback function for this value. My problem is I find it really hard to like explain code, you know, like I can explain the reasoning for it, but I just don't know how to explain like, okay, so like this is a callback function. Basically what it's doing is that every function, the function that you call within this method is the one that's actually going to update the code. I don't know how to do that, but I do hope it's clear. If it's not clear, my apologies. So yeah, what I'm doing, this should be export default theme context, not theme color, because I was doing theme color and I forgot to change it. So you can create your context property. The next thing you need to do is provide the context property. So now you've created the instance of the context. So how are you actually going to pass along this instance to the applications? That's where your provider comes into play. So the provider is just like what you call within your application. So you just have your theme.context provider and you're passing in the value as this use states default here. So this is using both React hooks and the context property. So think of it as you're just passing along a global variable to all your, to every single application, to every single component in your application. That is pretty much how provider works. Provider makes your states, the state value that you've defined, a global variable. And now finally, you've created your context and you've passed it along to the components. Now you want to actually use your context. And that's where the method use context, a bit on the nose there, comes into play. So now I have my context that I've created and I have my little provider. So now I'm going to call in my use context. And basically what I'm doing here is just updating the, where's my pointer? Yes. So this first one is my React hook, the same way this use impute change is that custom hook that I showed earlier. So I have my React hook with the state value name and then the action creator set name. And then I have my context hook as well with the state value theme color and the action creator set theme mode. And then in this instance, I'm using use context and this theme context, which is what we defined earlier in our create context file. That was a lot of words in that sentence, but yeah. And now I'm just gonna pass, use effect is basically like the components did mount of React hooks. So you need to pay attention to that. Basically what I'm just saying is that change the theme color name whenever name is changed. So in my input value, I am passing in name, which is this name here. So what I have is the local state name, and then I have the actual global state. Yes, the actual global state theme color. So I'm going to show you what this would look like basically. So now I have my parent component and I have my child component. So you can see that when I make changes in the parent components, it reflects in the child component. And in this important part, when I make changes in the child component, it also reflects in the parent component. I'm typing in the child, you can see that I'm typing in the child component, but it's not affecting the value. Stop clicking. I'm typing in the child component, but it's not affecting the value that's being rendered in the parent components. That's why this is. So that is why state management is really useful, because sometimes you just, of course, this is just like a basic example. It could be something else like handling, logging in and logging out at different states of the application, for example, or updating a cart at different states of the application based on what button has been clicked, for example. So yeah, this basically just says that context allows you to pass down state values to each component in a way that is not exactly unidirectional, or like I like to say, one direction, because I was really into one direction many years ago. So yeah, that is it for context. And then we have Redux. Redux is a slightly more complicated library than context. So according to their documentations, Redux is a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. What that means is, as opposed to context that just allows you pass down properties and you have to call use context everywhere, Redux actually allows you, it just has a lot more applications than context would, for example, especially when it comes to things like handling state asynchronously or dealing with all the side effects that could come from making changes, or just when you have like a really large, the thing with context is that every single time you want to create a new state variable, you need to create a new instance for it as well. And if you are having, let's say, if you have like, let's say 20 global state properties, that is like 20 new instances of use of create context that you need to come up with. And it could get very bogus. So with Redux, it's like now all of your application is just inside like this nice little state container, and you can just create as many state properties as you want, and it's perfect. So yeah, how does Redux work? There's this little chart that shows you how Redux works. So the first thing is that you have your store, and then your store property is where the state is kept. And then the state is passed down to the provider and then to the containers. The containers are each of the individual containers for your application, which the containers pass the state to the components render these changes on the DOM, and then the changes on the DOM that are rendered are passed to the actions, which are passed to the reducers. I have a little GIF that actually explains this much better, but I just felt like I had to go through the chart. So think of it this way. Think of your store as an actual store. You have a supermarket, right? And then you have goods in that supermarket. So the goods that your supermarket currently are the state of that supermarket. So if your supermarket is fully stocked, and let's say we have a shelf. Let's even go smaller than the whole store. Let's say we have a shelf. So your shelf is your store right now. And each of the products that are present on that store are an instance of states. Your action, your reducer is think of it as a function that carries out changes to the states. And your action is the changes that are being carried out on the states. So let's say your component, think of the component as the general manager. I really went far with this shop analogy. So yeah, think of your component as the general manager. The component is going to be responsible for issuing actions to the reducer. So let's say somebody takes a can from the shelf. Somebody taking a can from the shelf is your user interacting with your application. So now your application has been updated. That's your component then passes across the information to your reducer through an action. So let's say can has been taken from shelf. So now you need the shelf to be updated. You need the state of the shelf to be updated. If previously there were 24 cans, now you only have 23 cans. I need to update that state property. So it's going to be the job of the reducer to update that state property and then pass it back to the store, letting the store know that, okay, look, now we have 23 cans, or we have no cans at all, and we need to carry out a new action to actually update all the cans. So Redux is just like, it's a really, think of it as just like context, but like really, really big, you know? So instead of creating each instance of a state property, all the instances are already existing within the states, but Redux just helps you manage them. Hope that was clear. So yeah, and the thing with Redux and reducers is that reducers work under the principle of functional programming. What that means is that they are pure functions. Reducers ideally should be pure functions. So they should only pass in inputs based on they should only pass outputs based on the inputs that's passed into them. Think of it in a mathematical way. Basically, if I have 2 plus 2, 2 plus 2 should always give me 4. Or if I have a function add 2, for example, what that function to do is always add 2 to a variable. So I should be expecting the same answer every single time I call that option. If I call add 2 to 5, for example, I should always get 7. So think of it that way. And then also it shouldn't have side effects. Side effects are like secondary things that your function does aside from the initial purpose of that function. So if I have a function add 2, and I'm like, all right, add 2 to the function, but then within the function, I'm doing something like I'm console.logging a property, for example. Console.logging is a side effect because it is not the purpose of that function. By having a side effect, your function is no longer pure. Also, reducers work synchronously and they should be predictable. So what that means is that they work in tangent with the action or the property that's being called on them. So it's not like how set state works, for example. The minute you call a reducer, it does carry out the updating that it should do. And it's predictable. When you call your reducer, you expect it to do the function that you have defined within it in the way that you have defined. So now, but the catch is a lot of times we have large-scale applications, and a lot of large-scale applications have a lot of side effects. Side effects are things like needing to, let's say, make asynchronous calls. For example, your user is logging in and you want to make a call to your database to find out if they're authorized. If they're authorized, it should return an access token that you then log to or you store within your local storage, or all these things that you're doing side by side with the function that you just called on your component are considered side effects. And because of the way Redux works, they are against the philosophy of how Redux works. So that is where the term middleware comes into play. Middleware is basically functions or components or in some cases frameworks that allow you carry out all the side effects that are necessary for your application to run before passing across the modified action to the reducer. So going back to our store analogy, let's say that you wanted your reducer to update the number of cans on the shelf, for example. But before that, you wanted the cans on the shelf to be cleaned, or you wanted the shelf itself to be cleaned. Now, cleaning the shelf is a side effect from updating the number of cans on the shelf. And that's where the middleware comes in. So think of middleware as like a temp or an intern whose job it is to do all these side effects that the reducer, which is the actual employee, is not ready for. So you have your shelf and you want it cleaned. You call in your middleware does all that side effects for you. And then your middleware passes in the modified shelf, which is the now clean shelf, to the reducer. And then the reducer is going to carry out the actual actions that need to take place. Hope that was clear. So yeah, that was about that on state management and middleware. Even I know I only went a little into the middleware because I prepared for this talk to be around like 30 minutes. So that was why. So for in case you want access to any of the code that I've written, I do have like a little, I wrote some code for the context and for the Redux as well. And then all the other little, all those GIFs you saw where the state was being updated. If you want to check any of those out, this is the link here. You can go to github.com/Jemima Abu/React-state if you want access to these slides, because I do include some resources further down the end, and I do have some links that I also included at the beginning of the slides. You can go to my website, jemimaabu.com/slides/React-state, and you'll see the slides there. So yeah, these are some of the resources I did include for having a better understanding of state management in React, or the concept of state, or why certain things work the way they work. So there is React State Management 2020. Basically, it's just a really helpful article telling you all the new libraries that are out there and all the concepts and buzzwords that are flying around these days. There's also an article for why is set state asynchronous, because personally I found that interesting. I was not quite sure why it ran asynchronously, but this article did give a very helpful explanation of why that works. Then there's state management with React hooks only without using Redux or context is also very interesting in case you want to learn how to write custom hooks to manage. So not only for sharing state logic, but for actually managing global state itself using only React hooks. That's really interesting. And then yeah, in case you want to decide if you should use context or if you should use Redux, there's a link down there for knowing which is better for when. Personally, I do use Redux because that's what we use at work, and because it is more useful, because a lot of the applications we're building require a lot of state management across multiple components. But just in case you're not quite sure which you should be using or why you should be using one over the other, you can check out that article there. So that is about it. I will be taking questions now, or just like having a general open discussion. If you do have any other questions that you want to ask me after this talk, you can send me a message on my website, jemimaabu.com. Just fill out the contact form there, or you can reach out to me on Twitter at Jemima Abu, and I will take any of your questions there. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so y'all can see my face.
Right. As a Redux user, how much do you use state in Redux, and how much do you use like the useState hook?
Basically, I use both of them kind of equally, because I use Redux for like the global state. So for example, going back, I'm using is authorized a lot because the last project I was working on, that was like one of the most common state properties I had to call. So I have my is authorized global state property, and I pass that down in the container to my component. But then within that component, I have a lot of things that need to be updated, like for the inputs, all those little inputs you have. So you have things like name, or so let's say each of them is a form, for example. So you'd have like name or password or email. All those things would need to be local states because they only exist within that component. So I would use useState for that. But then for passing down the global state variable to the component, I would have to use Redux. So I kind of use them like equally.
Gotcha. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks. I'm glad y'all enjoy the talk.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure, totally.
So, and I think I might know the answer, but I'm not sure. Basically, you said that Redux is more predictable on things, but one of the main advantages is that you don't need like all these nested providers, right? You know, which if you use a lot of context, you do. But why is it that context can't be used to have like one giant like context object? You know, like the store in Redux, right?
I think because it kind of comes back to that whole wanting to kind of contain the logic of things with, of course, this is just like my opinion. I actually don't know. Maybe Dan Abramov has an article somewhere on that. But yeah, I think it's the same reason for why you cannot use your states, use states within all your components, for example, because they kind of just want to contain it within the instance you've defined it in. I mean, because I think that's why they probably went on to create like more larger state management libraries, because context should only be used for like, the purpose of context is only for passing data down. And that's really just it. It's not really made for handling. It's not really a state management library in the grand sense of the word. It's really just for passing data down. So that's why each time you want to pass data down, you need to create like an individual use context instance, and then have the provider for it, and then pass each of that. And the provider would only pass down that one instance that you've created, because that is how context works. They want everything to be singular and everything to be used for that one purpose. But like I said, that's just like my opinion on it. I will look into it later and see maybe there's actually a reason why context doesn't work at a grander size. But thank you, that was a really good question. Now I have something to look into.
Thanks.
Escape. All right, y'all, I'm still here for like 14 minutes. I mean, if y'all don't have any questions, I am looking for somebody who knows how to build WordPress sites, because I started building a WordPress site today and I hate it. I don't want to do it. So yeah, it's just, this is not going to be a rant about WordPress session. This is going to be a Q&A session. So I will be taking any questions you have and not ranting about my problems. Yes. Of course, if there are no more questions, we could really just wrap up now. And I'll just say like, thanks for everything. And, you know, have a nice night.
I've got another question.
All right, great.
So I use Redux quite a lot at work as well. And we use a library called Redux Saga to orchestrate events and updating the state. So it's basically really good for handling like asynchronous actions. But I recently did a poll at work, and it turned out that every one of the developers on the team actually didn't like the library, and we only kind of tolerated it because we thought it was good for its job, but it's kind of quite difficult to work with and to test. Do you have any better alternative middleware to orchestrate changes?
The one I use at work is Epix. Epix is the middleware library we use. It's Epix, right? Yeah, it is. Ugh, I can never remember. It's Epix and it runs on observables. Yeah, I was. Oh wait, no. God damn it. Is it Redux? I know it's either Redux observables or Epix. I have not used it in a while because that was back then. I don't use that now, but I did have to do a real quick check between, hold on. I have slides on this, so I'm just gonna pop into those real quick and see which it was. I know I looked into a couple. Why is this not typing? Slides. Middleware. Yep, Redux middleware for React application.
I posted a link in the chat as well. It's I googled it and it says like Redux observables / epics. Is that
so
it?
It's both. There we go. All right, yeah. So I looked into so there was Redux Thunk, Redux Saga, and Redux Observable. So Redux Observable works using like observables, but I have not used, my catch is I have not used Redux Saga before, so I cannot honestly say if Redux Observable is better. I just know I did find it a bit more straightforward because I had to learn middleware and Redux at the same time. So they were like two different concepts, because on one hand, you should not be doing any side effects here, but on the other hand, you should be doing all your side effects here. But I personally found Redux Observable to be okay. It was okay. So maybe you could look into that a bit and see if that.
Nice, thank you. I'll look into it. Is it kind of similar to reactive JavaScript, like RxJS?
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly what it is. It's very similar to reactive JavaScript because it works using all the function observables and thingies that it should do.
Cool. All right. Thanks a lot.
No problem.
Yeah, we use the same thing at my work as well. So yeah, comes highly recommended, especially if you quite like the concepts involved in the reactive programming. So yeah, I agree with you. That's all I'm saying.
I'll definitely look into it. Thank you.
So there you go. You can check that out. All right, y'all. It is 9:45 or 7:45 for most of you. I cannot see Barry on here, so I guess maybe he dropped off. So I guess it's up to me to bring an end to this. So once again, thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoyed the talk. I really hope you learned anything. If you do have any questions or anything you want to ask me, you can just, like I said, send me a message on my website, and I'd love to answer your questions. And yeah, have a nice rest of your night. Bye.